There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with another, in other words, it's been a minute. As I always say, this is an occasional series, so it's definitely an occasion to do it again after a break of several weeks. This is an occasional series where I talk about vocabulary, idioms, interesting grammatical patterns, anything like that that I encounter in my reading. I do not, as I want to make sure everybody understands, I do not hold myself out as any kind of expert in these matters, but I love doing, I'm an English teacher and I've studied English, but blah, blah, blah. But everything I'm presenting to you is not stuff I'm pulling out of my head, but stuff that I've found doing deep dives on etymology, dictionaries, and so on online. All right? Tonight, I have a bunch of stuff from the most recent Barbara Pym novel that I have read, which was several months back, her 1980 novel, A Few Green Leaves. Now, I believe she was working on this book much earlier, but it was published the year of her death. Hey, this is future editing Sean, and I was completely wrong. She wrote A Few Green Leaves between the years 1977 and 1979. So later in this video, when I speculate about whether the vocabulary was more current when she was actually writing it back in the 1950s, disregard that. She wrote this in the late 1970s. Of course, we can always speculate about what vocabulary she retained from when she was young, but I was wrong to suggest that she had begun this much earlier. It's not true!
Sphygmomanometer.
The first one is a word, a medical device word that I had never seen or heard pronounced, and I found two pronunciations for it, and in fact two forms of it. Oh boy, okay, so the easy one is sphygmometer, and there's the spelling, so that PH is pronounced, and it was an American voice on the pronunciation video, so I'm assuming that's the American English pronunciation, sphygmometer. But the British accented pronunciation videos tended to pronounce it I just spit when I tried to do that. Sphygmometer. So I think both are acceptable depending on where you live. But there's also a longer form with an extra syllable. It's really unwieldy. And again, either pronunciation. Sphygmomanometer or sphygmomanometer. I like the shorter one a little better. It's easier to say. Anyway, this is just a blood pressure machine. I've never heard it, have you? I mean, if you're in the medical field, I assume you have. But it was mentioned in the Barbara Pym novel. So it's that instrument with the inflatable rubber cuff that you put on the arm, connected to a column of mercury next to a graduated scale, which is able to measure blood pressure. Sphygmo or sphygmo, the prefix, comes from the Greek sphygmos, which means a pulse. And I couldn't find any other words that have that prefix. If you know of any, please tell me. Manometer is a noun, meaning an instrument for determining and indicating the elastic pressure of gases or vapors. Dates from 1730 in English, goes back to the French manometer, which people think was coined by a French mathematician. Going back to the Greek word manos, which means thin, rare, loose in texture, which in turn has been tracked way back to the Proto-Indo-European root word men, which I'll put up here, and that means small or isolated. And you can see that word in so many words that mean one. Monad, monarchy, one king or queen. Monastery, monism, monk, monochrome, monocle, all those mono words, monogamy, monolith, monologue, etc. They all go back to that same root, men, which also shows up in manometer or sphygmomanometer, and the men part in the device means few, scanty, measuring something that's hard to measure. That's interesting. I don't think I quite understand the connection to the device, but I get it a little bit. The next one, I was interested that in her novel, Barbara Pym used the word ambivalent in single quotes, and she called it, or her character, Emma, thought of it, and the phrase is, people's attitudes towards the flower festival were ambivalent, Emma thought, the jargon word coming into her mind. Again, this is a 1980 novel, but I think she was working on it at least in the 60s. Is it really that new? The meaning of having mixed feelings or contradictory ideas about something or someone? And in fact, yes, it is quite new. It's just over 100 years old in English. It showed up in psychology in 1916 and then became more generally used within 15 or so years, about 1929. Ambivalence, meaning simultaneous conflicting feelings, comes from the German ambivalence with a Z on the end, which was coined in 1910 by a Swedish psychologist, Eugen Bleuler. And he formed that from the German word that means equivalence in English, equivalens in German. Putting it together with the Latin root ambi means both, on both sides, ambidextrous, etc. And valentia, meaning strength. So equivalent means equal strength. Ambivalent means strength on both sides, for and against, conflicted, because both sides of your feelings are of the same strength. And valere goes back to a Proto-Indo-European root, wall. So that root, wall, gives us words such as avail, the surname and first name, Arnold. Convalesce, the surname or first name, Donald. Evaluation. So many men's names, Gerald, Harold, Arnold, Donald, all have embedded within them that Proto-Indo-European root meaning to be strong. Prevalent. Valediction. Valerie. Valetudinarian. Valiance, valiant. Okay, valiant, you can see it so clearly. Valid, valor, value, Vladimir, wield. Okay, that's fascinating. The next one is hedge dating, and my immediate thought of this was hedge dating was two people in a rural area flirting with each other across the hedge between their property or something, but no. Here's the quote. Before I forget, Tom, Heather was saying, I came across a very interesting new book on hedge dating the other day. Something right up your street, a completely new theory. And then it goes on to say Tom is completely uninterested in hedge dating. So hedge dating is actually figuring out, I shouldn't laugh, it's probably a very serious hobby for people, but figuring out how old a hedge is. I guess particularly in the UK, not probably only, but you can look it up. And, in England, those hedges, they're really old. So the way that you date a hedge, use maps and other documentary sources, but when those don't exist, you count the species diversity within a 30-meter stretch of the hedge, and that was developed in a book called Hedges, published in 1974. And there is a formula called Hooper's Rule, and it is the age of the hedge equals the number of species in a 30-yard stretch times 110 divided by 30, and that's how old it is. Oh my goodness. Please go out and date the hedge in your backyard and tell me how old it is. The next one is obtain. Obtain is it's a formal but very common verb, which means to get, acquire, secure something. But this meaning in this quote was not that meaning, and I have noticed it in my reading over years and years and years and never really got a handle on exactly what it meant or why it meant that. This is a really awkward date between a man and a woman, and Emma says, "Of course not. Would you like a drink?" Emma had almost said nightcap, the kind of thing associated with milkiness, and a generally more cozy atmosphere than that obtaining between them at this moment. That's funny. That's vintage Pym right there. That's I'd forgotten how beautifully and comedically she described that awkward date. But the atmosphere that obtained between them. What the hell? So that comes from a much more formal and I think very old-fashioned meaning of obtain, which is something that is prevalent, customary, or established. And in this context, it would be established. So you could read it as the atmosphere that had been established between them at this moment. It was not cozy enough to use the word nightcap. So it's a intransitive meaning of the word obtain. The meaning we all know, obtain a new car, that's transitive. There's an object. You buy, you get the new car. But this one is, there's no object. It's intransitive. Again, those grammatical words don't matter as long as you just understand one takes an object and the other doesn't. So this formal meaning is to be prevalent, customary, or established. And I'll just give you two other example sentences because it is kind of weird. The price of silver fell to that obtaining elsewhere in the ancient world. So established elsewhere, common elsewhere, customary elsewhere. How does all this fit with what obtains here at home? With what is established or customary here at home? Interesting. So let's just talk about obtain generally. In English, it dates back to the early 15th century, meaning to get or acquire, inherit, gain or conquer, coming from the Old French obtenir, same meaning, 14th century, and then directly before that from Latin, obtenere, which meant to hold fast, take hold of, acquire. The prefix ob means in front of, and tenere means to hold. Tenere goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root ten, which means to stretch. So I thought about this for a long time, and this is one, you can't always do this, but in this case, you can imagine how that went linguistically. So to stretch, if you think about getting or acquiring something, on holding something, you are stretching your hand to hold it. So I can really feel the visceral progression of that word. And so 10, here are a whole bunch of words. Some of them I can feel that stretching, holding, acquiring nuance in them. Others I can't, but there's just a huge list. Abstain, abstinent, attend, attenuate, baritone, catatonic, contain, monotony, maintain, lieutenant, tender, tendon, tenement, tenet, tennis, tenuous, tenure, tetanus, thin, tone, tonic. Again, some of them I can just kind of feel my way into how that happened, and others I can't, but it's just fascinating. And I only gave you a small fraction of that long list. Whew. I won't give you the quote because I don't want this video to go on too long, but the reference is made to Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain at Versailles, and they were two people, I don't know, their relationship friends or whatever, who in the early Edwardian era in Versailles, so Edwardian French doesn't really fit, but anyway, they wrote a book that describes their visit to a small little house, a chateau on the grounds of Versailles, where they claimed that they could see the gardens as they had been 200 years before, or 150 years before, in the late 18th century, as well as that they could see ghosts, including the ghost of Marie Antoinette. And they wrote this book, and it caused a sensation, and it was subject to much ridicule, of course. I would hope so. And so Barbara Pym is referring to that. It was obviously still, this Moberly-Jourdain incident was still recognizable within British culture at the time, again, that she wrote it, maybe not in 1980. There's lots of churchy stuff going on in Barbara Pym novels, and there's a phrase here, something or someone possessed neither thurible nor thurifer. So very quickly, a thurible is a metal censer suspended from chains, here's a picture or two, in which incense is burned during worship services. Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, Most churches, especially in the old days, used it. So it's the thing, and the person who carries it. So I don't know, I think you carry it processionally and then you put it down, hang it on something once the service begins, but the person who carries it is a thurifer. So the thurifer and the thurible comes from the Old French and going back to the Latin term thuribulum, which goes back to thuos in Greek and ultimately meant to sacrifice. All right, let's go from the spiritual to the carnal. Canoodle. Canoodle, I'd heard it and I vaguely knew what it meant. Means, to make out, to kiss and cuddle amorously. It dates back to the 1850s. It's said to be American slang. The earliest known sources are British. They're always blaming stuff on the Americans, eh? How come nobody blames any of the perverted expressions on Canadians, hey? It's not fair! Nobody exactly knows where it came from. There is a verb in Swedish, knulla, which means to fornicate. German, knuden. Knoodeln. Britta, help me. Knoodeln, which means to cuddle. But people aren't really sure. They haven't been able to establish. There's a folk etymology. In other words, people say it, but it hasn't been proven, that in order to get out from under chaperones, people went out on two-person canoes and then did as much frolicking on the bottom of the canoe as they could, canoodling. But again, it's a nice story. Nobody has proved it. Pappy bread. Somebody's in a little cafe or something, and he complains that it's expensive for a slice of pappy bread and a sliver of mousetrap. Let's deal with mousetrap first. I found no dictionary references to, but I went back a page before in the Barbara Pym novel, and they had a bread and cheese. So a slice of mousetrap is cheese, but you can't find any. I couldn't find anybody else except this Barbara Pym novel that used it thusly. Pap has a few meanings, but this meaning is bland, soft, or semi-liquid food. So a slice of pappy bread doesn't sound very appetizing. Bland, soft, semi-liquid bread. I assume it means bland bread. Pablum, I'm sure I didn't find. I won't take the time to check it because the rest of the definition is food such as that suitable for babies or invalids. So pablum, I'm sure, comes from that. I won't take the time. In South African English and the Caribbean, it meant porridge, means porridge. It has obtained a metaphorical meaning, worthless or trivial reading matter or entertainment, such as Sean the Book Maniac's videos. In South African English, it describes food that is flavorless and too soft, or a weak person. It goes back to Middle Low German and Middle Dutch, pappe, and probably based on the Latin word papare, meaning eat. Here's one that was new to me, an adjective, phrase, or idiom, hole and corner, meaning secretive, clandestine, furtive, or, and this was not the context in which Pym used it, and it seems to be less common, the other meaning is trivial and colorless, like pap, but secretive, clandestine, furtive. You can kind of imagine it, but I had to go back to the Oxford English Dictionary, which gave the definition: done or happening in a hole and corner, or a place which is not public. A secret, private, clandestine place, something underhanded. Contemptuously opposed to public or open, hole and corner. Now that is new to me. Treen. Pym loves writing about nerds and their nerdy hobbies, and somebody in this novel's collecting historical medical equipment. As well as Dr. G, here's the quote, as well as Dr. G's antique surgical instruments, a few bygones had been displayed on the table, by which Tom and Emma were standing. Examples of treen, such as a wooden apple scoop, and a dish and platter, and so on and so on. So treen, it's a uncountable plural noun, like stuff, right? Treated as plural, meaning small domestic wooden objects, especially antiques. And it's formed by adding, just like from wood, we get wooden, tree, we get treen. That suffix goes back to about the year 1000 in Old English. Originally meant made of a tree, wooden, and I had never heard of it. Drop a brick, sometimes known as drop a clanger. It means to make some kind of a social gaffe. Joe Biden, anyone? Or blunder, especially some kind of an indiscreet remark. So that is it. Today's was just from Barbara Pym's novel, A Few Green Leaves. Thanks for watching.